Right now, think Superstorm Sandy a distant memory? We'll tell that to tens of thousands of people in our region. Some still not able to go home. The numbers may surprise you. And next, where should sex offenders go after they've done their time? And if you think this is a problem with an easy answer, you ought to think again. One county in our region, they got a new and somewhat controversial approach. Supporters call it the toughest monitoring and enforcement program in the nation. And later, stop and frisk. New numbers from the NYPD confirm what many suspected. About 9 in 10 people singled out for scrutiny by the cops are people of color. We're going to hear from a city councilman who'll tell us what he thinks ought to be done about this. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thanks so much for joining us this Wednesday evening, February 6th. Now, remember all the bickering and stupid delays in Congress over the $60 billion needed to help the victims of Hurricane Sandy? Well, because it took so long, the first payments from D.C. are only now being approved. But that is just the politics of this. The real story and the real tragedy is here on the ground in our region, as we learn just how badly that cash is needed. And let's get to some of the numbers and the context from our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whit.
And Rich, we'll start with those numbers. Hurricane Sandy first hit our region on October 29th. So for Sandy victims, it's now been about 3.5 months out of their homes and not knowing what the future will bring. How many victims? 81,000 people and families have applied for rental assistance from FEMA, and about 4,000 people and families are still living in hotel rooms because their homes are either gone or unlivable. So far, the cost of both housing programs is a little more than $71 million. Money that is, while it's being used and needed, is not being used to help rebuild permanent homes for these folks. And the programs are scheduled to end this Saturday, February 9th, though officials are seeking to have that extended and likely will. But just having a roof over your head doesn't end the grief or the expense. We mentioned the hotel room program. Many of those rooms are in places like Times Square, where everything else comes at an inflated cost. And that's spelling big trouble for some storm victims.
Because I eat cereal every single day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner because my mom can't afford anything.
If they said, please, mommy, can I have an apple, to have that to give it to them, just the basic things that any mom would want for their child.
And there you have it. Imagine that story repeated 4,000 times with families and individuals living in hotel rooms in places like near convention centers and other busy, expensive areas all around our region.
Let's bring our table, talk about this. We got, as I said, a lot to get to over the next 60 minutes. And joining us this evening is Michael Tobman, a political consultant and former advisor to Senator Chuck Schumer, and a principal at Hudson TG, Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and Andrew, who you've already met. And Dom, I'll start with you, which is, on Friday was with a lot of officials in Jersey, from the town level through the state legislative level to even those that were in the congressional delegation. And when I said, do we know how the money is going to be distributed, to whom, how much, who gets what, they all gave me the same version of the answer, which is no. And I know the legislature wants some answers, but the governor seems to be the one and only who'll decide how this thing will get divvied out, and I'm not even sure they know. I think that there's a perception in the public that finally the money got approved, albeit late, and now, you know, manna from heaven, the worst is behind us, we got this all figured out. I get the distinct impression this thing's going to have as many questions as answers still going forward.
Definitely the case. More questions than answers. It's going to take, and we all feel so bad for the folks that are impacted by this. I mean, as Andrew was speaking, I was thinking about this. 4 months or whatever time it is in a hotel, 3 or 4 people in a hotel room. You can't warm up any food in a decent way. So it's good to answer your question, Richard. It's going to take some time. The governors, Cuomo and in Jersey, Christie, and also Connecticut, but they will, for the most part, determine how this money is going to be spent. But with the triggers and so on, it's going to take a while. We're talking about government. It's going to take a while before this money, I'm sure they're going to expedite as much as humanly possible. But if you're one of the folks that are affected by this watching us tonight, help is on the way, but I don't know how immediate it is.
And you know, when you use the alphabet soup, Michael, we don't know the answer yet, but when you're dealing with FEMA and you're dealing with different state agencies and you're dealing with insurance companies and you're dealing with a whole host of people that have their own checks and balances as to who's to get what, and they don't want to duplicate services, it makes what is already an impossible situation for these families that much more difficult, even expedited with all this bureaucracy that I understand why it's got to be there, but it's now 3 months plus later, and these people have had it.
Emergency preparedness and emergency response is not just about the storm and recovery and rescue, but it's also about what happens 30, 60, 90, 120 days later. New York and New Jersey are still struggling with this, and officials, elected officials, appointed officials, agency heads don't know how the money is going to be distributed and how the families get it. That, too, is part of emergency response, and we need to do a better job of that. As good a job as Governors Christie and Cuomo did in the day of and the week of, this part now is also going to be part of their legacy and how they're going to be measured.
And Andrew, I almost want to say to the people in advance who are going to complain in a few months about waste and mismanagement and money not being, that's part of the story. It's got to be. You got to get it to people fast here. Some people are going to game the system. Some people are going to be screwed in some way. But I don't want to hear people later on saying, oh my God, they spent $120 on a hammer for whatever. You got to get the money out fast.
Well, that may be the cost of doing business. There may be some of that happens, and I'm sure we will hear some of those complaints and those kinds of stories going down the road. It's to be expected, but I think the benefits outweigh that potential cost. The other concern that I have, we mentioned the lawmakers you mentioned in New Jersey that you spoke with on the train to Washington, or the bureaucracy. Everybody's going to want to have a say in where this money goes, because if you're a state assemblyman or a state senator, you want to be able to say, I got you this money, the same way that Chris Christie wants to say that, the same way Andrew Cuomo wants to say that.
And there's a
everybody's going to want to have.
They're also trying to say at the same time, look what we talked about yesterday. Governor Cuomo, he's trying to buy out certain properties right now because he knows the next flood is going to be the same problem all over again. So while you're trying to, through a pretty way of saying eminent domain, where you're trying to take over certain areas, people are also trying to take some of those monies and prepare for the next storm, because there will be a next storm. So it's not even just the immediacy now, it's how to get ahead of the next one.
And that was some of the money that got factored into the request that came from Cuomo and from Christie. Not all of that made it into the final submission to Congress, and not all of that was authorized by Congress. And let's also point out that any plans for eminent domain or for securing some of this property would not come out of the $60 billion that was authorized by FEMA. That
I will tell you, lawmakers have real concerns that some of the monies, if there's wide discretion at the governor's level, and I think it has to be in this case, there's real concern that budget shortfalls in a tough economy with property revenues down and everything else, that some of the shortfalls are going to be made up with the money, even though there's a stipulation that says it has to be spent on storm relief. We all know how things work here. There's a worry that it could be diverted a little bit.
You tell me. I mean, we saw the Battery Tunnel, and we saw some subway lines that got flooded out. Should preparing, not just recovering that because it's up and running, but should preparing that to withstand the next storm be part of the recovery effort from this one? If you think about it, it's a legitimate concern. And going forward, it's got to come from somewhere. And when the next storm hits, you want to prevent some of the problems that we had this go around.
Meanwhile, the population that is still living in hotels and motels that are suffering are a bit of a self-selected group, because if you have the resources and you have the safety net and you have the family network to be someplace else, if you have the ability to navigate the insurance payment process, then you are doing that. Otherwise, these are people that had needs and were living paycheck to paycheck and week to week before.
Living in homeless shelters now. Right. I mean, people that are in shelters right now because they got nowhere else to go.
And victimized again by the whole process.
All right. Obviously, a story here, as we've been saying many times, that is hardly near the finish line, unfortunately, and we're going to continue to follow. We take a quick break, though. When we come back, where should sex offenders go after they've done their time? Let's face it, this is a population that nobody wants to take ownership of right now, but they are there, they're in large numbers here, and community after community seemingly is making up the rules as they go along as to what to do with them. And there is no easy answers here. One county in our region, they got a new and a pretty controversial approach. We'll talk about that after this.